it's interesting, I think, that their examples are largely taken from examples intelligible to the lay adult in the public domain of the ordinary person. Philosophers who are interested in a priori knowledge don't want to get into issues about its formation. Of course, Piaget has to get into issues of its formation because he's got a triadic conception of knowledge. Take anything that you know whatsoever, but Piaget, it always had a formation from simpler precursors, and it always has the potential to be developed into something better. So, for Kant, all knowledge has its debut in experience, but not its direct demonstration. The occurrence of an a priori truth is one thing, and it's good to see them, but you might be blind to its a priority. And of course, as a young person, I was. I think my great moment came in a maths lesson on Euclid's theorem, I've forgotten the number, dealing with the Pythagorean theorem. And I'd gone through all the proof, the Euclid proof is long and laborious, and it seemed to be a completely pointless exercise, tailor-made by mathematics teachers to bore the pants off boys and girls. And then I got it. God knows how or why, but it came one day, and I suddenly grasped the implication between the premises and conclusion. The implication being the relation of necessity. Now, Kant is claiming that, with Leibniz, that the introduction of an a priori truth is one thing. How it's grasped, its a priority, that's something else altogether. And it's that which psychologists have failed to investigate in my reading of psychological research, with one major exception. There are some comments about Wittgenstein. I don't know how I found the 1915 quote, but he pointed out then that the a priori was the central problem for him in all of his philosophy. And you have also this nice example from 1944 of we haven't got a lower the distribution of prime numbers, but if there were one, it would be a low embodying a necessity, and therefore knowable a priori. But it wouldn't be an analytic a priori truth. Moorman's paper is very recent, and he's just adding a nice reminder that Kant, you might want to disagree with Kant or agree, but you've got to consult him. At least Kant was trying to show how the normative and the causal, the implicatory and the causal, are conjointly needed in science as we understand it. Okay, paragraph 3. The 3 Bs are Binet, Karl Bühler and Cyril Bird. They introduced logical reasoning into psychology at the turn of the 20th century, and well done on them for doing that. Binet, if you read his background papers, is clearly troubled with Kant. His education in the 19th century would have, good French education, he would have been introduced to Kant's philosophy, the critique of pure reason with its account of a priori knowledge. And Binet had trouble in trying to show how his account of children's intelligence would fit Kant's static model, because the a priori of Kant doesn't change at all. Bühler, his focus was upon trying to show how judgments with a truth value are understood by young children. His examples are very simple. For an adult, they look child's play. But what Bühler is trying to do is to say, hey, look, somehow what the adults get, somehow it has a formation during childhood, and we should investigate that. And that includes whether and how children become knowledgeable about the a priori. Burt, to my knowledge, doesn't address these issues, but he does give the Edith example. Piaget's judgment and reasoning in the child has a replication of that study. The text that you've got here is a direct quote from Burt. I think Burt's version is a bit ambiguous as to who the she is, but anyway, well done, Cyril, for introducing it. But they didn't investigate the a priority of deduction. They certainly introduced deduction, and deduction is here to stay in psychology. But whether it is a deductive implication that's being investigated is a moot point. I would say it hasn't been yet. Chomsky reduces the a priori to the innate, largely, I guess, because Leibniz does to some extent. But Kant was pretty clear that the a priori and the innate are two different things. The innate can't account, what is innate can't account for the logical necessity, e.g. of the relation of implication. Konrad Lorenz has some very fascinating remarks in some of his writings where he says it's impossible to do zoology or biology without addressing the theory of knowledge, without addressing epistemology. It's quite explicit on Lorenz's part, Konrad Lorenz. And Piaget is well aware of Lorenz's view, and Piaget has a similar view. If you're going to do psychology, you must address epistemological questions of the sort that Kant and Plato and so on address. There are some exceptions where at least the a priori is mentioned, and I've listed the main ones that I can find for you there, one of which, of course, is Dick's book from the 1980s and subsequent. Okay, there is one exception to who's investigated the a priori, and that's Piaget. A good example of it is in The Child's Conception of Number, as you know, jointly written with Alina Shuminska, a woman whose name is unfairly removed from authorship of the famous book. Chapter 1 identifies 3 so-called stages in number development, the third of which is referred to as necessary conservation. Why is the word necessary stuck in there? Because it's not really well explained by them. They just presuppose you understood Wittgenstein's remark or Leibniz's remarks about this. But it's necessary conservation because they're interested not in whether this child is a conserver or not, can conserve number. They're interested in how the conservation number is understood. Is it understood as an a priori necessity? Piaget's main distinction is going to be that he agrees with Kant that the a priori is a necessary, requires a necessary relation of implication to be grasped by the knower. But he disagrees with Kant, who seems to think that the a priori categories that he can't identify. Piaget disagrees with Kant's claim that those categories are there from the outset. It's almost as if, although Kant says the a priori starts in experience somewhere, it's almost as if Kant is saying, well, you got them at birth as a birthright. You don't need to do anything to get them. They're already there, waiting to be used. Now that conception is roundly criticized, rejected by Lalande and by Piaget. He wants to deny that the a priori categories are there ab initio, from birth onwards. What's the alternative? Guess what? It's going to be a construction. Other books which make explicit reference to the a priori are, besides the Child's Conception Number, are the book on the conservation of substance, weight and volume. It's explicit there. And also in The Growth of Logical Thinking, where a priori is something like the lay adult's sense, lay adult's understanding is intelligible, according to Piaget and Helder, because of the integration, structural integration of combinatorics and the INRC group. That's interesting, I think, because of his 1923 remark, which I put in bold on the handout, of an expérience mentale. Expérience mentale reads like mental experience in English, and it can mean mental experience in English. It can also mean a thought experiment, a mental experiment, an expérience de pensée. And the point about an expérience mentale, the point about a thought experiment, is that it requires an understanding of an implication. Because in a thought experiment, you're setting up a hypothesis, you're making a prediction which is an implied conclusion of the hypothesis, you then carry out the observations or experiments to verify or falsify that prediction, and then you then, on the basis of the implication, draw the relevant conclusion. Piaget's claim is that carrying out thought experiments in the proper scientific sense, that requires a priori knowledge. And it's late in its development because it's darn hard to do. The other key notion is prise de conscience. It's translated in the first book language in Thought of the Child as conscious realization. I think that's the best available English translation of it. But the prise de conscience is, in some sense, or can refer to a person's grasp of an implication as a special relation, different from other relations such as causality. I don't want to knock down causality. We can't do without it. If you're going to investigate the actual world, causality is there. It's there for good. You can't understand the actual world without understanding its causal relation. But it's not the same as implication, because as well as understanding the causality of facts, you need to put them into some sort of order. And that comes from a deductive system, system of derivations, central to which are necessities through implications, understood as a priori. Okay, I'm going to stop there and say this. Piaget at least addressed the problem of cap, knowledge a priori. He did regard it from almost first to last as an essential feature of his theory of knowledge. He made a start on investigating it, but by no means completed the task. One reason is because of his final work on reason, la raison. And that is where the Henriquez quote comes in usefully. Because Piaget's claim is that there isn't so much a mechanism with its physicalist overtones responsible for the a priori. There is an agency, however, which we have at our disposal, and that is our capacity to give reasons for things, reasons for our thoughts, reasons for our actions, and reasons for the truth of something or the falsity of something else. Enrique's book is a very fascinating summary of Piaget's theory of knowledge, and of course you've got 60-odd or 80-odd Piaget books yourself to take the best from there. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Les, a comment about a source and a question about a source. The comment is Thomas Kuhn described himself as a Kantian with movable categories in the last interview before his death in 1995. So that is another big name to add to your list. Thomas Kuhn.
Okay, thank you.
And I actually have the book on me, so I can give you the full, complete reference.
I'll get the email, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, and the question I have is the Gödel reference.
Sorry, could I just ask you what's in Kuhn's book or in a paper?
It's in an interview that was reprinted in the Rhodesian Structure,
Okay, right.
which is the third Kuhn book of philosophy rather than a
So it's not in a paper. I mean, the reason for harping on about this is that papers are more accessible in the modern world at any rate than books. And not everyone wants to read a philosopher's book.
I'll scan it to PDF and send it to you.
Could you summarize it for him, Jeremy?
Yes, it's a complete retrospective of his life, the reason why he did everything, and including mention of the influence of Piaget. And I'll talk more about Kuhn and Piaget tomorrow, I think, in the session that Abel has organized. But the question I had for you, Les, was the Gödel 1995 references to the collected works. I recognize the reference, but what of the collected works is this a reference to?
I simply wanted to get a list of key logicians who were committed to what I'm calling the Wittgenstein thesis, that all deductions are made a priori.
Right, but
Gödel
died
being
in
a key logician, I wanted to see what he had to say.
Sure, but he died well before the collected works were published.
Sure.
So what of the collected works?
In haste, I forgot to look.
Okay, I'll find it.
I was just pleased to find it.
Yeah. It's a cool one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you have spoken also about the synthetic a priori in Kant. Kant is notre père à tous, selon Piaget. And I think that the Piagetian theory is very important to understand what are the synthetic a priori in Kant. Two examples, you have mentioned them, but I think you did not relate them to the synthetic a priori.
Yeah.
The one is causality. If we make experiences, experiment, as Kitchener said, science is make experiments. Then you manipulate nature to establish a state a given state, and then observe what is the consequence. Here you have to work with causality.
Yeah.
And Kant says you cannot. Kant does not say that causality or conservation is inborn. You have said that for Kant a priori is not inborn, but Kant says that for making science we have necessarily make some presupposition. One is that of causality, the other is conservation. We cannot measure anything without believing that there is a conservation of what we measure, that when we finish our measurement, the quantity has not changed.
I ducked it. Guilty.
And this
I don't quite, but I did so on purpose because the main issue is a priority. And I see that as largely absent from current psychology, 20th century psychology too. And I wanted to focus on that first, and then could come on to that. But of course, there's also the complication of Niels Bohr and quantum indeterminism, and how you square that with the Kantian view of causality. And so that's another legitimate issue, but I didn't want to, mask the main problem today. Sounds as though I've got to do another go.
It's an identity problem.
Yeah. I am aware that there's an issue there. Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks very much. Mark.
This may take a slight bit, which is why I didn't say anything until there was silence. Have you looked at the possible role of implicit definition in these issues about the nature of apraiorism?
No, I didn't.
I asked that because there's many avenues to get to it, but one that stems from something we talked about, the definition, not just confident anyway, true in virtue of meaning. And this gets rejected, but it's arguable that it gets rejected because Kant had a false notion of meaning. And that the understanding of meaning post-Kant evolved more and more toward meaning not in terms of some basic things that are true about the world, like, for example, the Euclid's axiom is taken to be true about space, implicit definition. And is that a familiar concept?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me that you have views about this and that they are worth pursuing. I wanted to focus on the main thing for me, which is the a priori, and not. It actually covers quite a lot, and this is another area which should be pursued, and I would only plead that I didn't have the time today to pursue it.
Well, what I would suggest is that if you have these classical frameworks, then both the nature and the origin of these kinds of understandings has to either be empirical or the nature of mind, which is generally interpreted as innate.
Yeah.
And I know you want to reject those,
Yeah.
but implicit definition gives an alternative.
Yeah.
It gives a completely alternative way of thinking about what it is for something to be a priori.
But quite how anyone, how an implicit definition emerges in anyone's mind, that's another delicate question.
No, it sure is, yes.
Yeah.
But
On which you have interesting views.
yes. I hope they're interesting. I have views.
I wouldn't judge that. Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a maybe basic question, but how do you understand implication by Piaget? What implies what? Is it a statement implies a statement? Is it the meaning? Is it the knowledge implies the knowledge?
Well, let's be very boring and take all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I heard that a long time ago as a little boy and just sort of learned it like a nursery rhyme. I always thought that I would be immune to the immortality thing. Just shows. But I didn't understand it I didn't understand the a priority of the necessary conclusion. I could chant it out, parroting, you know. But Piaget is claiming that it links propositions in adolescence, and for that you need the 16 form, etc. Actually, Wittgenstein has that list of 16 form operations in Tractatus, so that's a well-constituted, well-founded system. But as to what else has implications, that's an open question. According to Piaget, concrete operations is not based on proposition. Concrete operational reasoning is not based on propositions, and it also requires an actual basis for the instantiation of it. I mean, what's emerging from your questions, thanks very much, is at least 4 areas or further avenues of research on the a priori. Okay. Thanks very much for coming, folks. Sorry. Ulrich, look, you were especially...
I was a discussant, I was planned to be a discussant.
Sorry, Ulrich.
I have not much to say because I just wanted to raise questions for the presenters, but also for the audience. And there has to be this peculiar form of science that Piaget did, and that he called it genetic epistemology, which now becomes even more confusing for me, thanks to you, because of the terminological mismatch and the difference. It becomes complicated. Very. Yeah, and I think it also indicates to me that Piaget is not entirely consistent, which we all know. It changes quite a bit